Hi, I'm Don Luce. I'm Curator of Exhibits at the Bell Museum of Natural History at the University of Minnesota. And we're at the Audubon and the Art of Birds exhibition here at the Bell Museum. It is an exhibit that looks at the work of John James Audubon, but also looks at the work of 40 other artists and really traces the development of this fascination with birds in human culture. This sort of intersection of art and science, this what you might call the artist-naturalist tradition from the Renaissance to the present day. The centerpiece of the exhibit is a collection of prints from Audubon's double elephant folio. These are considered his sort of great work. This is the prints that were made from 1826 to 1838. And there are 435 of these in the complete collection. We have 35 in the exhibit here today. And they are really sort of what made Audubon's name. But when we were developing this exhibit, we felt it was really important to take a broader view, to look at this whole development of this sort of human fascination with birds. And so the exhibit actually includes the works of 40 other artists and over 100 different works, and going from the 1500s to the present day. And so by putting Audubon's work in context, I think you can really appreciate how revolutionary his work was, how different it was from what came before, how his work is still an inspiration for artists today. But it also is a way to really highlight some of the significant contributions of other artists and how they have really played this role, these artist-naturalists, from the Renaissance to the present day in the development of our understanding of nature and the development of science as we know it today. The exhibition is organized around a series of themes that each one has a sort of way of sort of how it explores how these artist-naturalists have looked at nature, looked at birds, but also they, in roughly chronological order, sort of this development of science from the Renaissance to the present day. So the first section here, this what we're calling catalog and creation, talks about the sort of basic step in trying to do science, and that's sort of and of natural history. How do you tell one thing from another? How do you describe and catalog and record this diversity of nature? And so this has been one of the efforts and one of the goals of artists and scientists from the very earliest time periods. And so what we have here is actually the earliest natural history book, done in the 1500s. It was an attempt to record all of nature, all that was known about each species. This is the volume on birds by Conrad Gessner. And each bird, there's a woodcut that depicts that bird, and Gessner compiled all the information he could find from all the previous manuscripts together into this one book. And it's really an amazing feat, and it sort of marks the sort of start of science, really, of natural history in the Renaissance. And we can look at the character of these early images. Many of these artists were working from preserved specimens. Some were actually just working from written descriptions. Many of them had never seen these birds in life. And so they're very typical of these early natural history illustrations. The birds are shown in kind of stiff profile view. They're not really doing much, and they're almost sort of cartoonish in their depiction. And that was really what was considered the standard scientific illustration until until Audubon came along. There was really simply trying to put enough detail in there so that you can identify the sort of dead bird specimen that you might have in your hand. On this wall, we have taken a series of works, all depicting the same species, the Carolina parakeet. And it goes from the early 1700s with Mark Catesby, the earliest depiction of this species. This is the Carolina parakeet, is the only native parakeet to eastern North America. It shows the Carolina parakeet eating the seeds of this bald cypress. And it's actually kind of a breakthrough piece because it actually includes the bird and this plant together. But it's as so typical of the time period. It's a very rudimentary drawing that shows a bird in stiff profile view. Some of the several other works, for example, one by Alexander Wilson, done before Audubon, shows the bird a little bit more animated, but still it's kind of an isolated specimen. And then we get to this print here. This is a print by Audubon, and it's an amazing, you can see here what an amazing breakthrough that Audubon made and how different his work was than anything that came before him. He shows these birds not as isolated specimens, but he shows them as living organisms. And what is so incredible about in this species, the parrots, these Carolina parakeets, they're very social. They live in groups. And he shows them in this group interacting. They have a very distinctive way of how they move and how they climb on the vegetation. And he shows that. He has them in all these various different positions so that you get a whole sense of how they move and how they interact with each other. He shows adults and a juvenile to show the different kinds of plumage. He shows the top of the wings, the underside of the wings, and he shows this one down here just looking, staring right out at you. But not only has he shown these birds in this incredible lively interaction, but he has them on one of their most favorite foods, this cocklebur. They eat these seeds, and so there's a whole story about these cocklebur seeds that he writes about. The seeds themselves are poisonous. These parrots were able to eat these poisonous seeds. The cocklebur was considered a serious weed to many farmers. And so it's an incredible depiction of this bird in life. And of course, what is so significant about this today is that these Carolina parakeets are now extinct. And so here is this record of this amazing species depicted by a person who really knew them in life. And so this is such an incredible document that we have this still today. And then the wall ends with this depiction done by Walton Ford. He's a contemporary artist. He is someone who continues today to be inspired by the work of Audubon and other early artist naturalists. And he's depicted this group of Carolina parakeets. It's a work entitled Dying Words. And he's read some of the documents that Audubon has written about the birds and other people have written about the Carolina parakeet. And one of the reasons why the parakeets went extinct is that they were so social. And so when hunters would shoot into a flock, the wounded birds would keep calling, and the other birds would come back to their wounded companions, and that would allow the hunter to reload his gun and shoot again into the flock, killing and wounding more of the birds. And so in this way, they could actually wipe out the entire flock. And so in this depiction, Dying Words, Walton Ford shows these Carolina parakeets coming up around the wounded companion, and it's actually based upon some of these sort of classic war paintings done in the 18th and 19th century showing the wounded general dying on the battlefield. So there's all these commentary that Walton Ford uses, but you can still see this continuing influence of Audubon even today. One of the things we want to try to do is get people to participate in the actual method that Audubon used to make his art. He wrote a little bit about how he did it, and there's some dispute as exactly how he was able to achieve this perfect depiction of many of these birds. Like all the artists of his time, they didn't have any photographs. They didn't have any film. They didn't have any even binoculars, okay, to look at these birds. So primarily their subjects had to be dead birds in one way or another. Many artists before Audubon worked from dead birds that had been preserved and taxidermied and stuffed. And so by the time they got to look at them, their form was not particularly lifelike. So one of the breakthroughs that Audubon made was, instead of taking the dead bird and doing that whole taxidermy section, he took the fresh bird, and while he still had the memory of it in life, he would pose the bird in a position that, as best he could, remember it in life. Also a very dramatic and artistic position of the bird. And then he would work on trying to make an exact one-to-one drawing of the bird. And one of the big breakthroughs he made was he would mount the bird, pin the bird onto a board that had a grid background. And using that grid, he would be able to then accurately depict the bird in that position and deal with some artistic issues like foreshortening that were very hard to do otherwise. And to show the wings spread and the tail spread and the beak open and all these other positions that he wanted to have the bird in, and do it in a way that it was really accurate in terms of proportions. And so we said, could we actually do that in the exhibit? Could we have people try this out? And so we had this blue jay set up in a position that was pretty close to the way Audubon had them drawn in his plate of blue jays. And so by counting the squares, you can figure out where the beak is. You can figure out where the eye should be on the page. You could see where the tips of each of the feathers should be. And by marking each of these out, you can draw then in around those marks and get this very accurate silhouette of the bird. And then, using that, fill in the rest of the detail. So this is one of Audubon's big breakthroughs. And it was a technique, actually, that many Renaissance artists used, and before photography, a lot of other artists used, but probably the first natural history artist to do this. And it's one of the ways that he achieved this great breakthrough. And I think we have found that many people just coming into this exhibit can sit there at this pad of paper, make this sketch, and then hopefully tear it off and take it home with them. One of the really fun things about developing this exhibit was the ability to kind of compare Audubon's work to the works of other artists. And you can really see the similarities and differences between these artists. And so in this case, we've got two falcons, a peregrine and a gyrfalcon, done by different artists. And these are very similar birds. They're incredible hunters. And this plate here was done by Joseph Wolf, a German artist, worked in England most of his career. He was an expert on falcons and other raptors. And it's a beautifully done print, shows the bird really well. In the background, you see he has sort of this diagram of it hunting a mallard duck. And it does a really great job of talking about the natural history of the species. But it is sort of a standard depiction of here's a bird at rest in terms of the peregrine falcon. Audubon, on the other hand, takes a totally different view. Here he has, these are, I think the gyrfalcons might be the largest falcon. He's showing them life-size. He has them in this incredibly dramatic pose with one diving down, the other one on the rock. They're sort of calling to each other. Could be sort of a mating display, this flight. Many people would criticize this because it's sort of physically impossible. This diving bird could never be this close to another bird sitting there without, of course, crashing into it or crashing onto the ground or rocks. But it is artistically so dramatically different than the sort of typical depiction. So visually, it's this incredible tour de force. And that's kind of this difference that Audubon made versus these other artists. He is not sort of telling a literal story. He's telling this drama that you have to kind of interpret in a sort of an artistic way. Another great comparison between Audubon's work and the work of earlier artists would be these two images of the yellow-breasted chat. Now the chat is it's a large warbler. It's very common in southeastern United States. And the one image here by Mark Catesby, again done in the early 1700s. He was this early artist, naturalist, explorer. He explored the southern colonies. He shows this chat. It's kind of a charming little piece in a way because it looks like the chat is sort of sitting on top of this trillium, but sort of an awkward position. It's one of the few attempts that Catesby made to try to show the bird in flight. So it has its wings raised, its feet are kind of dangling down. It has a sort of awkward charm, that naive charm that Catesby plates are famous for. And it's always curious what he was really trying to do with this plate. Is it really a sort of a dead bird, and he's kind of sort of drawing the wings out? The wings are not drawn very accurately. So there's a lot of questions about it. And then we look at this plate of chats that Audubon did. It's actually one of his most controversial pieces. There are a lot of works that Audubon did that people criticize, often criticize as being inaccurate. And this is one that was severely criticized. It shows, for example, 3 male chats flying and displaying around a nest with a female in the nest, okay? We know, of course, that chats are territorial birds. You wouldn't have 3 males around the nest. They wouldn't, of course, necessarily be doing this display at the same time that they're nesting. He was severely criticized for this. In fact, his original, he actually had a 4th male chat in this, in an even more awkward position. And people say, you know, the birds look funny. They got their legs hanging down and their wings are in weird positions. Well, chats do this unusual display flight with their legs hanging down early in the season when they're defending their territories and attracting mates. And what Audubon is really showing is a story, the life story of this bird. So here is this male early in the season doing these display flights, and he shows the male in a number of different positions so that the viewer can kind of get a sense of how acrobatic this display is. And then here later in the season is the couple at their nest with the male bringing a caterpillar to its mate in this beautiful little vignette of flowers. And so in a way, you have to, again, interpret this in a non-literal view. You have to look at this. He is telling this whole narrative story about the bird. Not all of this is happening at the same time. And so that's one of the ways that Audubon is so different and why he's so important, because he really is getting at the life history of these living birds. Okay, this section of the exhibit is called Birds in the Environment. And it's really looks at bird art kind of after Audubon, because during Audubon's time period, the focus was really still on the bird itself. And Audubon was really primarily interested in getting the depiction of the bird correctly. And he, in quite a few of his plates, he does show a background landscape. But many, when you actually do the research, you discover that many of these landscapes were actually painted by other artists. He hired other assistants to help him with doing this, because he never felt as if he was really all that good at painting a landscape. It's a fascinating piece, the snowy egret. Here's the snowy egret in all of very detail, painted life size. And then you've got some plants around it. And then in the background, you have this beautiful little landscape of this southern rice plantation, which is one of the places that you would see these egrets. And you even actually see someone coming up here, which might actually be Audubon himself with a gun out looking to collect birds. And so, but it's very much the bird with a landscape backdrop. And during sort of at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, there was this development of this conservation movement and also development of the science of ecology. And the people became aware of the importance of, first of all, the environment for the protection of the species, the habitat that they need, and also this idea that the bird, the animal, are really interlocked into this sort of ecosystem, this codependency, this interdependent system. And so you have artists like Francis Lee Jaques that really picked up on this idea of ecology and of an ecosystem and had a very, very different view than of birds and the environment. So you look here again, this is an egret. It's in a southern environment, but it's a very, very different depiction. You have all the elements of that ecosystem shown here, the pines, the southern pines, the shrub layer indicated underneath the pines, the grasses, the sort of red oxidized mud that you would see in a southern environment. So you can even get sort of a sense of the warm, humid air, the atmosphere in this depiction. And there the egret is as one small little piece of this sort of ecological puzzle. And so it's a very sort of turning this image of the bird sort of on its head. Rather than the bird being the focus, the landscape with a landscape backdrop, you have this sort of image of this environment, sort of this ecosystem, with the bird being just one piece of that. The last section of Audubon and the Art of Birds is what I call life and death in bird art. And this is a theme that you can look at in a number of different ways. First of all, one of the things that Audubon and many of these other early artists were trying to do is how do you capture this essence of life from this almost always a dead specimen that the artist is looking at, okay? And so that was always a challenge, and one of the things that Audubon was able to really capture. But also, Audubon, I think, probably more so than maybe many people today, had a very realistic view of the struggle that birds went through in their daily lives. He knew that they didn't live idyllic existences, and that they not only had to eat and kill other things to eat, but often many things were out to try to kill and eat them too. And so you see in his art many examples of this sort of life and death struggle. The osprey, for example. Here it is grasping this gasping fish with its talons piercing the body of the fish. And of course it's calling at the same time. And this creates this incredible, it's one of my actually very, very favorite plates. The way Audubon depicts the wings, the way he has that closest wing foreshortened and coming out at you. And this fish, I mean, it's just an incredible depiction. The swallowtail kite, same thing. I mean, this is an incredibly beautiful bird. Not only is the form beautiful, but the way it flies is so beautiful. And I think he really does capture the sort of, their flight is sometimes compared to a sort of butterflies. They have this incredible light, airy flight. And one of the things that they do, the amazing things, is that they swoop down and they can actually pull snakes out of trees, okay, and catch them. And so here he has, again, the swallowtail kite grasping the snake, and you can see it's coiling up on itself in this sort of death coil. And one of the, of course, greatest sort of life and death depictions that Audubon does, he shows this golden eagle, dramatically enormous bird. Of course, he was limited to the size, even though he was using the largest size paper available, what's called the double elephant size paper. He couldn't obviously show an eagle with spread wings in flight, but he did the best he could. It is, in the beautiful depiction, probably not very accurate, but in terms of would a bird be able to suspend itself in air like this. But very, very dramatic depiction. And then in its talons, he has this cute white bunny with the talons of the eagle piercing its eyeball and blood dripping down. And so he contrasts beauty and horror sort of right next to each other. And that's one of the things that really, he builds drama into his works. And it's one of the things that really makes his work stand out from many, many other artists.